Wolf during funeral leaves priest nervous as it howls at the coffin. Non-stop before we begin, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below telling us where you're listening to this story from. Father Michael O'Brien had conducted hundreds of funerals in his 30 years as a priest in rural Tasmania. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The white wolf stood barely 3 meters from the mahogany coffin, its head thrown back, releasing a mournful howl that seemed to pierce straight through the grey winter sky and into the very soul of every person gathered at the graveside. The mourners stood frozen, some in shock, others in fear. Father Michael's hands trembled as he clutched his prayer book, his carefully prepared eulogy forgotten. The wolf howled again, the sound so raw, so filled with grief, that several people began to weep, though whether from their own sorrow or the animal's profound display of loss, no one could say. This was the funeral of James Whitmore, a 68-year-old wildlife ranger who'd spent the last 40 years working in the Tasmanian wilderness. James had been found 3 days ago, collapsed on a forest trail, his heart having simply given out during his morning patrol. He died doing what he loved, surrounded by the nature he'd devoted his life to protecting, but no one had expected a wolf to show up at his funeral. Tasmania didn't even have native wolves, not anymore. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, had been declared extinct nearly 90 years ago. Yet here stood this magnificent white wolf, its fur pristine against the frost-covered ground, its amber eyes fixed on the coffin as if willing the man inside to wake up. "Someone call Wildlife Services," whispered Margaret Chen, James's long-time colleague, her voice barely audible over the wolf's continued howling. That thing could attack someone. But Father Michael found himself raising a hand to stop her. There was something in the wolf's behavior, not aggression but anguish. Pure, undiluted grief. The story, he would later learn, went back 10 years. James Whitmore had been on a solo expedition deep in the western wilderness when he'd heard whimpering coming from a rocky outcrop. Investigation revealed a wolf pup, no more than a few weeks old, trapped in a crevice. Its mother was nowhere to be found, likely killed by farmers protecting their livestock, a common tragedy in areas where predators and agriculture met. James had 2 choices: leave the pup to die, or break every regulation in the Wildlife Management Handbook by rescuing and rehabilitating it himself. Being James, there was never really a choice at all. He'd called the wolf Ghost, for its pale coat and the way it seemed to appear and disappear in the forest like a phantom. For 6 months, James had bottle-fed the pup, taught it to hunt, prepared it for life in the wild. His colleagues had warned him forming attachments to wild animals was dangerous, both for the human and the creature. Wild animals weren't meant to be tamed. But James hadn't been trying to tame Ghost. He'd been trying to give him a chance at the life he deserved, free, wild, untethered. When Ghost was strong enough, James had released him deep in the protected forest. He'd watched the young wolf bound away into the trees, and though his heart ached, he knew it was right. Wild things belonged to the wild. That should have been the end of their story. But it wasn't. Over the following years, James would occasionally catch glimpses of Ghost during his patrols, always at a distance, always watching. Once, when James had slipped on a rocky trail and twisted his ankle badly, Ghost had appeared from nowhere, sitting 10 meters away, watching as James splintered his own ankle and limped back to his vehicle. The wolf had followed at a distance the entire 3 kilometers, ensuring the man who'd saved his life made it home safely. James's wife, Catherine, had died 5 years ago from cancer. Ghost had appeared at the edge of their property on the night she passed, sitting vigil in the tree line until dawn. James had seen him from the bedroom window and had broken down, knowing somehow that the wolf understood, that he wasn't alone in his grief. Now, standing beside the coffin, Father Michael understood why Ghost was here. The wolf hadn't just imprinted on James. They'd formed a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. Ghost had lost his family twice. First his birth mother, then his surrogate father. The howling continued, each cry seeming to say what words could not. "Come back, please, come back, don't leave me alone." Sarah Whitmore, James's 32-year-old daughter, stepped forward. She'd flown in from Melbourne as soon as she'd heard about her father's death. She'd been 6 months pregnant, and the stress of losing her dad had worried everyone. But now she walked slowly towards the wolf, ignoring her husband David's urgent whispers to stay back. "Oh, Sarah, no," David called out. "It's wild. It's Ghost," Sarah said quietly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Dad told me about him. Sent me photos. He said Ghost understood things other animals didn't." She stopped about 2 meters from the wolf. Ghost ceased howling and lowered his head, those amber eyes fixed on her. Father Michael saw intelligence there, and something else. Recognition, perhaps. "He loved you too," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave him so much joy, Ghost. Every time he saw you in the forest, he'd come home and tell Mum about it. After she died, knowing you were out there watching over him, it helped him keep going." Ghost took a tentative step forward, then another. The mourners held their collective breath. This was a wild animal, a predator, unpredictable and potentially dangerous, but Sarah didn't flinch. The wolf came close enough that his nose nearly touched her hand. He sniffed once, twice. Then he looked up at her face, and Sarah saw what her father must have seen all those years ago, not a beast, but a soul. Grieving, lost, searching for comfort in a world that had taken away the one constant in his life. "I know," Sarah whispered. "I miss him too. Every day is going to hurt for a while." But he wouldn't want us to stop living. That's not what he taught either of us. Ghost's tail, which had been low and still, moved slightly, not a wag, but an acknowledgement. Then he turned back to the coffin, sat on his haunches, and released one final, heartbreaking howl, a goodbye that echoed across the cemetery and into the surrounding forest. Father Michael, his initial nervousness replaced by something like awe, decided to continue the service. His voice, when he spoke, was steadier than he'd expected. "We gather here to celebrate the life of James Whitmore, a man who understood that we're not separate from nature, but part of it, that we share this world with creatures who feel, who remember, who love, and today we've been given a profound reminder of that truth." As Father Michael spoke, Ghost remained beside the coffin, his posture one of vigil rather than threat. The mourners, their initial fear fading, began to see what Sarah had seen. This wasn't a dangerous predator at a vulnerable moment. This was a bereaved soul paying respects to someone who'd meant everything to him. Margaret Chen stepped forward, pulling a worn notebook from her coat pocket. "James kept journals," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "Detailed records of every animal he encountered, every intervention he made. I'd like to read something he wrote about Ghost 3 years ago." She opened to a dog-eared page and began to read. "Saw Ghost again today near the upper falls. He's magnificent now, fully grown, his coat so white it almost glows in the forest shadows. He kept pace with me for nearly an hour, parallel but never approaching. At one point, I sat to rest, and he sat too, maybe 15 meters away. We just existed together. No need for interaction beyond that mutual acknowledgement. Sarah asks me sometimes if I regret not keeping him, domesticating him. But that's not love, is it? Love isn't about possession. It's about wanting the best for someone, even when that means letting them go. Ghost is exactly who he's meant to be. Wild, free, magnificent, and somehow impossibly, he still chooses to check on me. That's not gratitude. That's family." Margaret's voice broke on the last word. She closed the journal carefully, tears streaming down her weathered face. The service continued with stories from colleagues, friends, and family. Each person who spoke mentioned James's unique connection with the natural world, his ability to see beyond the human perspective and understand the forest as a living, breathing entity where every creature had value and purpose. Throughout it all, Ghost remained. When they began lowering the coffin into the ground, the wolf stood, walked to the edge of the grave, and watched with an intensity that made Father Michael's throat tighten. This was comprehension. Ghost understood, at least on some level, that his friend was leaving forever. After the coffin settled into place, Ghost did something that shocked everyone. He reached down with one large paw and scraped up a pawful of the loose earth beside the grave. Then, deliberately, he let it fall into the hole, onto the coffin's polished surface. "Bloody hell," David muttered. "Did that wolf just participate in the burial?" Sarah was openly weeping now. Her husband put his arm around her shoulders as she struggled to maintain composure. "Dad always said animals understood more than we gave them credit for. I didn't realize how right he was." As the mourners each took their turn, placing earth on the coffin, Ghost remained at the graveside, his presence a silent testimony to a bond that death couldn't break. When everyone had paid their respects, Father Michael approached the wolf cautiously. "I don't know if you can understand me, mate," he said quietly, "but James was lucky to have you, and you were lucky to have him. That kind of connection. It's rare, sacred even." Ghost looked at him with those piercing amber eyes, and Father Michael had the uncanny sensation of being truly seen, assessed, and understood. The gathering began to disperse, mourners heading back to their cars for the drive to the wake at the local community hall. But Sarah lingered, and Ghost lingered with her. They stood together at the graveside, woman and wolf united in their grief. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked the wolf, not really expecting an answer, but needing to voice the question anyway. "Where will you go?" Ghost turned his gaze from the grave to the forest beyond the cemetery's edge. The wilderness that had been his home, his territory, his domain. But then he looked back at Sarah, and something in his expression seemed almost uncertain. "You can't stay here," Sarah said gently. "This is a human place. You belong out there, in the wild, just like Dad wanted." As if he'd been waiting for permission, Ghost took a few steps towards the tree line. Then he stopped, looked back one more time at the fresh grave, and released a soft, low howl, not the piercing grief cries of earlier, but something quieter, more resigned, a final acknowledgement. Then he turned and loped into the forest, his white coat visible between the trees for a few moments before disappearing completely. Sarah watched him go, one hand pressed against her belly where her unborn child, James's first grandchild, grew. "Goodbye, Ghost," she whispered. "Thank you for loving him." The wake was held at the Bruny Island Community Hall, a weathered building that had hosted countless gatherings over its 80-year history. People filled plates with food and swapped stories about James, each memory painting a picture of a man who'd lived according to his values, who'd chosen compassion over convenience, understanding over judgment. Margaret found Sarah standing by a window, staring out at the forest, visible in the distance. "He'll be all right," Margaret said. "Ghost, he's survived this long on his own. Your father made sure of that." "I know," Sarah replied. "It's just, I keep thinking about how lonely he must be. Dad was probably the only positive human interaction he ever had. And now he has his memories," Margaret finished. "Don't underestimate the power of that. Animals remember, Sarah. They carry their experiences with them. Ghost might be alone in body, but he'll never be alone in spirit. Your father gave him that gift." Over the following days, as Sarah stayed on to handle her father's estate, she heard reports from the rangers. Ghost had been spotted near James's old patrol routes. near the cabin where he'd lived, near the places that held significance in their shared history. The wolf was processing his loss the only way he knew how, by visiting the spaces his friend had occupied, searching for traces of the man who'd saved his life. Father Michael visited Sarah at James's cabin 3 days after the funeral. He brought tea and scones, and they sat on the porch watching the forest shift from afternoon gold to evening shadow. "I've been thinking about what happened at the cemetery," Father Michael said. "About Ghost. In all my years of ministry, I've never seen anything quite like it. The way he mourned. It challenges some fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, of soul, even. Dad used to say that the mistake we make is thinking we're separate from nature," Sarah replied. He'd say, "We're not above it or outside it. We're part of the same web, made of the same stuff, driven by the same fundamental needs, connection, purpose, love." I think Ghost proved that, didn't he? "I think he did," Father Michael agreed. "And I think your father's legacy isn't just the forest he protected or the animals he saved. It's the reminder that the boundaries we draw between ourselves and other creatures, they're often artificial, created by us, not by nature." 2 weeks after the funeral, Sarah was preparing to return to Melbourne when she received an urgent call from Margaret. "You need to come to the ranger station. Now. It's about Ghost." Sarah's heart sank. Had something happened to him? Had he been hurt, or worse? Had he attacked someone? She drove the winding forest roads faster than was safe, her mind racing through possibilities. When she arrived at the station, she found Margaret standing outside with 2 other rangers, Tom Bradley and young Mika Tanaka, who'd only been with the service for 6 months. They were all staring towards the tree line. "What's wrong? Is Ghost hurt?" "Not hurt," Margaret said, a strange expression on her face. "Come see." They led her around the building to the back, where James's old office window looked out onto the forest. And there, sitting at the edge of the clearing exactly where he'd be visible from that window, was Ghost. "He's been there since dawn," Tom said quietly, "just sitting, watching the building. Specifically, watching your father's office." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Ghost was looking for James, returning to places where he'd seen him before, unable to comprehend why his friend wasn't there anymore. "Has he approached the building?" "No, he keeps his distance, respects the boundary. But Sarah, he won't leave. We've tried everything short of tranquilizing him. This is the 3rd day." Sarah made a decision that probably broke a dozen regulations. She walked slowly towards the tree line, towards Ghost. The wolf's ears perked up immediately, his amber eyes tracking her movement. When she was about 10 meters away, she sat down on the cold ground. "He's not here, Ghost," she said softly. "I know you're looking for him, but he's gone. He's not coming back to this place." Ghost tilted his head, that gesture so dog-like it made Sarah's heart ache. He stood and took a few tentative steps closer, then sat again. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, woman and wolf sharing grief in the cold morning air. Finally, Sarah stood, her muscles stiff from sitting. Ghost stood too. She had an idea, probably foolish, definitely irregular, but it felt right. "Will you come with me? I want to show you something." She turned and walked slowly towards her father's old pickup truck, which she'd been planning to drive back to the cabin. To her amazement, Ghost followed, maintaining his respectful distance but clearly interested. She opened the truck's tailgate, which James had modified with a non-slip mat for transporting equipment. "Dad used to take you places in this, didn't he?" "When you were little." Ghost approached the truck, sniffed the tailgate, and Sarah could have sworn she saw recognition in his eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he jumped up into the bed of the truck with surprising grace. "Are you seriously about to drive through town with a wolf in the back of your truck?" Margaret called out, somewhere between amused and horrified. "Just to the cabin," Sarah called back. "He needs closure. We both do." The drive took 15 minutes along quiet forest roads. Ghost stood in the truck bed, his nose testing the wind, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. When they pulled up to James's cabin, the wolf jumped down before Sarah had even turned off the engine. The cabin was a modest structure built by James's own hands 30 years ago. It had been his sanctuary, his retreat, the place where he was most himself. Ghost approached the front door and sat, waiting. Sarah unlocked the door and pushed it open. Ghost didn't rush in. He entered slowly, cautiously, his nose working overtime to process the scents. Sarah watched as the wolf moved through the small space. The living room with its wood-burning stove, the kitchen with its simple table, the bedroom where James had spent his last night before that final, fatal patrol. Ghost spent several minutes in the bedroom, his nose pressed against the bed, the wardrobe, the worn armchair where James had sat to read before sleep. Sarah realized with a lump in her throat that the wolf was searching for a scent trail, trying to find where James had gone. Finally, Ghost returned to the living room. He looked at Sarah with what she could only interpret as confusion and sorrow. James's scent was here, but James was not. For a wolf, scent was everything. It was truth. It was reality. The presence of James's scent without James himself was a paradox Ghost couldn't resolve. "I know it doesn't make sense," Sarah said, sitting on the floor. "Death doesn't make sense to any of us, really. The person we love is just gone. But their scent lingers, their belongings remain, and we're left trying to understand how someone can be so present and so absent at the same time." Ghost approached her and, for the first time, laid his head against her knee. The weight of it, the warmth, the trust inherent in that gesture, it broke something open in Sarah. She wept, her hands buried in Ghost's thick white fur, and the wolf remained still, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. They stayed at the cabin for 3 hours. Sarah showed Ghost all of James's things, his ranger uniform hanging in the closet, his collection of field guides, the photos on the walls documenting years of conservation work. She talked to the wolf as if he could understand every word, and perhaps in his own way he did. "Dad left something for you," Sarah said, remembering suddenly. She went to the bedroom and retrieved a wooden box from the top shelf of the wardrobe. Inside was a leather collar, handcrafted, with Ghost's name burned into it. Attached was a note in James's distinctive handwriting. Sarah read it aloud. "For Ghost, I know you'll never wear this. You're not meant to be owned or marked. But I made it anyway, because making it helped me feel connected to you, even when months passed without a sighting. If you're reading this, whoever you are, it means I'm gone. Please know that Ghost is not dangerous. He's family. Treat him with the respect and love he deserves. J.Du." Sarah's voice broke on her father's initials. She set the collar down where Ghost could see and smell it. The wolf approached, sniffed it carefully, then looked up at Sarah with what she swore was understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of orange and gold, Sarah knew it was time. She walked to the door and opened it wide. "You can't stay here, Ghost. This was Dad's place, but it's not yours. You belong out there, in the wild. You know that, don't you?" Ghost stood at the threshold, looking out at the forest, then back at Sarah. He seemed torn, caught between the familiar comfort of this place that smelled like James and the call of the wilderness that was his true home. "Go on," Sarah urged gently. "He'd want you to be free. That's why he let you go the first time, and that's what he'd want now. Live the life he gave you. That's how you honor his memory." Finally, Ghost stepped through the door. He paused on the porch, looked back at Sarah one more time, then bounded off into the darkening forest. Sarah watched his white form disappear among the trees, feeling a sense of rightness despite the sadness. Sarah returned to Melbourne the following week, though leaving felt harder than she'd anticipated. She wasn't just leaving her father's home, she was leaving Ghost too. But life demanded she return. Her baby was due in 2 months. and there were preparations to make, a nursery to finish, a future to build. The months passed. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy in early spring. She named him James, after his grandfather, with the middle name Whitmore. Little Jamie, as they called him, had his grandfather's grey-blue eyes and what Sarah's husband David swore was already a stubborn streak. Sarah stayed in touch with Margaret, who provided regular updates about the forest and occasionally about Ghost. The wolf had been spotted several times near James's old patrol routes, always alone, always watching. He seemed healthy, was clearly still hunting successfully, but there was something different about him, Margaret said, a solitude that seemed more deliberate than circumstantial. When Jamie was 3 months old, Sarah made a decision. She needed to return to Tasmania, to introduce her son to the place his grandfather had loved, to close some circle she couldn't quite name, but felt compelled to complete. They made the trip in autumn, when the Tasmanian forests blazed with colour. Sarah, David, and baby Jamie stayed at a rental cottage near Bruny Island. On their second day, Sarah asked Margaret to take them to one of James's favourite spots, a clearing near a waterfall where he'd often sat to write in his journals. Margaret drove them as far as the track allowed. Then they hiked the final kilometre, David carrying Jamie in a baby carrier on his chest. The infant's eyes were wide, taking in the towering trees, the play of light through leaves, the sounds of the forest. When they reached the clearing, Sarah's breath caught. There, on the far side near the waterfall, sat Ghost. He was facing away from them, looking out over the water, the picture of wild nobility. His white coat was pristine, his posture regal despite the grey that had started to appear around his muzzle. "Is that?" David whispered. "Yes," Sarah breathed. "That's Ghost." Margaret held up a hand, signalling them to be quiet and still. They watched for several minutes, just observing. Then Jamie, in the way that babies do, let out a small sound. Not quite a cry, but a coo of interest. Ghost's ears swiveled immediately. He turned his head, those amber eyes finding the group. For a moment, Sarah thought he might run. It had been 8 months since they'd last seen each other. Would he even remember her? But Ghost stood and began walking towards them, not quickly, not threateningly, but with purpose. He approached to within 5 meters and stopped, his gaze moving from Sarah to David to the small bundle in the baby carrier. "It's okay," Sarah said, as much to David as to Ghost. "This is Jamie, James's grandson." Ghost tilted his head, studying the baby with what looked like curiosity. Jamie, showing no fear whatsoever, reached out his tiny hands towards the wolf, making those grabbing motions babies do when they want something. "Sarah, I don't think this is a good idea," David said, his voice tight with concern. But Sarah had an instinct, the same one her father must have had with Ghost all those years ago. She slowly approached the wolf, Jamie in her arms now, close enough that the baby could see Ghost clearly. "This is your grandfather's legacy," she said to Jamie, though he was far too young to understand. "This magnificent creature exists because your granddad saw him, really saw him, and chose compassion over convenience." Ghost's nose twitched, taking in the baby's scent. Then something extraordinary happened. The wolf sat and very gently reached out one large paw, placing it softly on the ground near Sarah's feet, not touching her, but close. It was a gesture of trust, acknowledgement. Sarah felt it was both. Jamie laughed, that pure, delighted baby laugh that speaks of joy untainted by worry or fear. His small hand patted the air in Ghost's direction, and the wolf's tail moved slightly, a barely perceptible wag. They stayed in that tableau for perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt both shorter and longer. Then Ghost stood, gave Sarah one long, meaningful look, and turned back towards the forest. But before he disappeared into the trees, he did something he'd never done before. He looked back, directly at Jamie, and Sarah would swear for the rest of her life that the wolf nodded, a small dip of his massive head, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even blessing. Then he was gone, melting into the forest like the ghost his name suggested. Over the following years, Sarah brought Jamie to Tasmania regularly. They'd hike James's old trails, visit the cabin, leave flowers at the grave, and sometimes, not often, but enough to feel meaningful, they'd catch a glimpse of white fur through the trees, Ghost watching, always at a distance, a silent guardian of the forest his friend had protected. When Jamie was 5, old enough to understand, Sarah told him the whole story, about his grandfather who'd saved a wolf, about the wolf who'd attended a funeral, about bonds that transcended species and survival. "Why doesn't Ghost come live with us?" Jamie asked with a child's simple logic. If he loved Grandad, he could love us too. "Because Ghost belongs to the wild," Sarah explained, using almost the same words her father had once used. "And we love him by letting him be exactly what he's meant to be, free." Father Michael, who'd kept in touch with Sarah over the years, invited her to speak at a special service on the 10-year anniversary of James's death. She stood in the same church where her father's funeral had been held and told the story of Ghost to a packed congregation. "My father taught me that love isn't about possession or control," she said. "It's about wanting the best for someone, even when that means letting them go. He gave Ghost life, freedom, and dignity. And Ghost gave my father something equally precious, proof that compassion matters, that connections can form in the most unexpected places, and that the boundaries we draw between ourselves and nature are often illusions." She paused, looking out at the faces before her, some who'd known James, others who'd only heard his story. That day at the cemetery, when Ghost appeared, everyone was frightened. They saw a predator at a moment of vulnerability. But what Ghost was really showing us was that grief is universal, that love transcends species, and that the family we choose, whether human or animal, can be just as powerful as the family we're born into. After the service, Margaret approached Sarah with news. Ghost had been spotted that very morning, near the cemetery, sitting at James's grave. Rangers had observed him from a distance for nearly an hour before he disappeared back into the forest. 10 years to the day, Margaret said quietly. He remembered. Sarah visited the grave that evening alone. She sat beside the headstone, now weathered by a decade of Tasmanian seasons, and spoke to her father as she always did during these visits. "Jamie's doing well, Dad. He wants to be a ranger like you when he grows up. Says he wants to protect the forest and all the creatures in it. Wonder where he got that from." A branch cracked in the tree line. Sarah's heart jumped. She looked up and saw him. Ghost, now fully grey around his muzzle and eyes, moving a bit slower than he once had, but still magnificent, still wild, still free. They regarded each other across the distance. Sarah didn't approach, didn't call out. She simply raised her hand in greeting, in acknowledgement, in gratitude. Ghost sat, his amber eyes reflecting the setting sun, and Sarah had the sense of a promise being kept, a circle being closed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for loving him, for remembering, for showing us all what loyalty really means." Ghost remained for a few more minutes, then stood and walked slowly back into the forest. Sarah watched him go, knowing with certainty that this would be the last time. Ghost was old now, his time in this world growing short, but he'd lived a good life, a wild, free life, just as James had wanted. When Sarah returned to Melbourne, she wrote down everything, the funeral, the visits, the moments of connection. She titled it Ghost, A Story of Love and Wilderness, and submitted it to a publisher who specialized in nature writing. The book was released 2 years later and became a bestseller, introducing thousands of people to the story of a ranger and a wolf and the extraordinary bond they'd shared. Schools began using it to teach children about wildlife conservation, about the importance of protecting natural habitats, about seeing animals as individuals deserving of respect and compassion rather than as resources or threats. Ghost passed away that winter, found peacefully in a den not far from James's old cabin. The rangers who discovered him reported that he looked serene, as if he'd simply decided it was time to rest. They buried him near the waterfall, in the clearing where he'd last seen Jamie, and placed a small marker: Ghost, Wild, Free, Remembered. When Sarah heard the news, she didn't cry. Instead, she felt a profound sense of rightness. Ghost had lived 20 years, remarkable for a wild wolf, and every one of those years had been on his own terms. He'd died free, in the forest he loved, near the memory of the man who'd given him a second chance at life. The legacy of James and Ghost lived on in the countless people inspired by their story. Conservation efforts in Tasmania received renewed support. People looked at wildlife differently, with more compassion and understanding. And somewhere in the Tasmanian wilderness, their spirits roamed free, man and wolf, forever connected by a bond that death couldn't break. The story that began with a nervous priest and a howling wolf at a funeral had become something larger than any of them, a reminder that love, in all its forms, is what makes life worth living, and that sometimes the most profound connections we make aren't with our own species, but with the wild things that remind us we're part of something much larger than ourselves.